Caleb Thorne stared at the words he had written, the ink stark against the cheap paper. Widower, 34, owner of solvent ranch in Montana Territory, seeks respectable woman, plain or comely, for purposes of matrimony. No illusions of romance. Seeking partnership against the wilderness. Reply via postmaster, Big Timber. The advertisement felt like a surrender, a final, desperate admission that the solitude he had cultivated for a decade had finally become a prison. He had placed it in the territorial newspaper 3 weeks ago, a single act of hope so terrifying he had immediately regretted it. He had not checked the postmaster since. The thought of a reply, of a real person responding to his bleak proposal, was more frightening than a winter with no meat. He had built this life nail by nail, log by log, after the war had scoured everything from him. The ranch, nestled in a valley carved by a stubborn creek, was his fortress. The mountains that ringed it were his sentinels, their jagged peaks clawing at a sky that was often the color of slate. He had come here to forget the screams and the smoke of Shiloh, to silence the ghost of his wife and son, taken by fever while he was away playing soldier. For 10 years, the silence had been a balm. Now it was a weight, pressing down on him until his own thoughts echoed back, hollow and strange. The ad had been a moment of weakness, a last chance before he gave up entirely and let the quiet consume him. The wind began its assault just after noon, a low moan that escalated into a shriek. It was the first blizzard of the season, and it came with a viciousness that spoke of a long, hard winter ahead. Caleb had spent the morning securing the stock, his movements economical and sure. The cattle were in the lean-to, the horses stamping in the sturdy barn he'd raised with his own hands. Smoke plumed from the stone chimney of his cabin, a defiant gray flag against the churning white of the sky. He was prepared. He was always prepared. It was the one thing he could control. Inside, the cabin was a bastion of warmth and order. A fire crackled in the hearth, its light dancing over the hand-hewn log walls and the simple, functional furniture he had made. A stew bubbled on the iron stove, filling the small space with the scent of venison and root vegetables. He sat at his table, cleaning his rifle, the familiar metallic scent of gun oil a small comfort. The blizzard howled like a wounded animal, throwing fists of snow against the single glass window pane. It was a sound he knew well, the voice of the wilderness trying to reclaim its own. He was running a cleaning patch down the barrel when a flicker of movement outside caught his eye. It was almost nothing, a distortion in the blinding swirl of white. He froze, his senses, honed by war and the wild, snapping to full alert. It was impossible. No one would be out in this. No animal, let alone a person. He squinted, leaning closer to the glass, his breath fogging a small circle on the cold pane. There it was again, a dark shape, stumbling, struggling against the gale. It was upright, human. A curse left his lips, low and bitter. Trouble. Trouble always came on the back of a storm. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive and alone for so long, was to ignore it, to let the wilderness have what it claimed. His valley was his own, and he had no charity for fools who got themselves caught in a blizzard. He had posted no signs of welcome. His solitude was a warning. But the shape fell. It did not just stumble, it collapsed, a heap of dark cloth vanishing into a fresh drift of snow. And something inside Caleb, something buried under a decade of hardened grief and isolation, broke loose. It was the code, the one his father had beaten into him long before the army had refined it. You did not leave a person to die, not if you could help it. It was a rule as unyielding as the mountains themselves. With another curse, this one aimed at his own damnable conscience, he stood. He pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, shoved his hat down tight on his head, and wrapped a scarf around the lower half of his face. He grabbed the coil of rope by the door, a precaution against getting lost in the whiteout just feet from his own cabin. The warmth of the room felt like a memory before he even opened the door. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his exposed skin. The world had dissolved into a roaring, featureless white. He tied one end of the rope to the iron door latch and began to walk, feeding the line out, his eyes straining to find the spot where the figure had fallen. It was a fool's errand. He was a fool, a man content in his misery, now risking it all for a stranger who was probably already dead. He found the shape half buried, a mound that would have been invisible in another minute. He knelt, his gloved hands digging frantically. He uncovered a shoulder, then a head. The face turned away from him. He brushed away the snow and saw a tangle of dark hair, frozen stiff. He rolled the body over. It was a woman. Her face was pale as marble, her lips tinged with blue. Her eyes were closed, her dark lashes stark against the deathly pallor of her skin. She was dressed in city clothes, a wool coat that was wholly inadequate for the Montana wilds, and a traveling dress that was already torn and frozen. A lady. What in God's name was a lady doing in his valley in the middle of the first winter storm? He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, under the line of her jaw, expecting to find nothing, but then he felt it. A pulse. Faint, thready, but there. A flicker of life in the frozen expanse. The decision was made for him. He could not leave her. He gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He turned his back to the wind and began the slow, arduous trek back to the cabin, following the lifeline of the rope, the unconscious woman a strange and terrifying burden. Eliza Lowell surfaced from a deep and suffocating cold into a world of gentle warmth. For a moment, she thought she had died, and this was some strange, quiet anteroom to the afterlife. The air smelled of wood smoke and something savory, like meat and herbs. A thick, heavy weight rested on top of her, and the scratchy texture of wool was against her cheek. She was lying on something soft yet firm. Not her own bed. Not the floor of the train car. Not the frozen ground. Her eyes fluttered open. The light was dim, golden. She was in a small room, the walls made of massive, rough-hewn logs. A fire danced and snapped in a stone fireplace to her left, its heat a living thing on her skin. She was in a bed, a simple cot, tucked under a mountain of wool blankets in what felt like a heavy animal pelt. Her own clothes were gone. In their place, she wore a man's long-sleeved undershirt, the fabric soft from many washings, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fog in her mind. She sat up too quickly, and the room tilted violently. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back against the pillow with a soft groan. "Easy." The voice was deep and quiet, coming from across the room. It held no menace, only a flat note of command. Eliza turned her head slowly. A man sat at a small wooden table, his back partially to her. He was large, his shoulders broad under a simple flannel shirt. His hair was dark and thick, longer than was fashionable in Boston. He was not looking at her, his attention focused on the bowl of stew in front of him. But she knew he was aware of her every movement. He was the source of the scent of wood smoke, clean sweat, and the faint, sharp tang of winter air that clung to him. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice a dry, scratchy whisper. "My cabin," he answered, without turning. He gestured with his spoon toward the window, which was now just a black rectangle against the night. "You were lost in the storm." The storm. It came back to her in a rush of terrifying images. The train lurching to a stop, the conductor announcing a washed-out trestle ahead, the indefinite delay. Her own mounting panic, the certainty that Silas Croft's men would be on the next train, that they would find her. The desperate, foolish decision to walk, to follow the tracks to the next town, a town she now realized was much farther than she had imagined. Then the snow, starting as a gentle flurry and quickly becoming a blinding, roaring monster that stole the path, the sky, the very world. And then, only the cold. You saved me," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He finally turned his head, and she saw his face for the first time in the flickering firelight. It was a hard face, carved from the same unforgiving landscape as the mountains outside. His jaw was strong, shadowed with a day's growth of beard. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, were guarded, assessing her with an unnerving stillness. There were lines around them, lines etched by sun and sorrow. He was not a handsome man in the polished way of the men she knew back home, but there was a raw, compelling strength in his features. He looked like a man who had seen too much and said too little. "You were freezing to death on my land," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. He turned back to his stew. "It was an inconvenience." Eliza bristled at the word. An inconvenience. She, who had been running for her life, who had nearly died, was an inconvenience. The pride that had driven her from a life of gilded captivity in Boston flared in her chest. She pushed herself up again, this time more slowly. "I apologize for the imposition," she said, her voice gaining a measure of its usual strength, though a chill still clung to her bones. "I will be on my way as soon as the storm breaks." He grunted, a sound of dubious assent. "That might be a few days. The stew is hot. You should eat." He gestured with his head toward the stove where a pot simmered. She looked down at the man's shirt she was wearing, acutely aware of her vulnerability. "My clothes?" "By the fire, drying." He pointed to a wooden rack near the hearth where her dark traveling dress and underthings were draped. The sight was both a relief and a source of deep embarrassment. This stranger had undressed her. A wave of heat rushed to her face that had nothing to do with the fire. But he had also saved her life. The two facts warred within her. "My name is Eliza Lowell," she said, deciding that formality was the only armor she had left. He took another spoonful of stew before answering. "Caleb Thorne." The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of two people from different worlds, thrown together by fate, each wary of the other. Eliza's stomach rumbled, a traitorous betrayal of her attempt at dignity. Caleb heard it. A faint muscle twitched in his jaw. Without a word, he stood. He was even taller than she had guessed, moving with a contained, deliberate grace. He ladled stew into another bowl, took a loaf of dark bread from a tin box, and cut a thick slice. He placed it all on a small tray and brought it to her bedside. "Eat," he said again. It was not a request. He set the tray on a crate beside the bed and returned to his table, his back to her once more. Eliza looked at the food. The stew was thick with meat and vegetables, its aroma making her head swim with hunger. She had not eaten since the day before. Swallowing her pride, she picked up the spoon. The first mouthful was blissfully hot, chasing the last of the deep cold from her body. It was simple food, rustic, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate quickly, ravenously, not stopping until the bowl was clean. She sopped up the last of the gravy with the coarse but flavorful bread. When she was finished, she felt a profound sense of warmth spread through her, a deep cellular gratitude that went beyond mere politeness. This stoic, ungracious man had pulled her from the jaws of death and fed her from his own pot. He had saved her, and then he had ignored her, a combination that she found both infuriating and, strangely, reassuring. He did not seem to want anything from her. Not thanks, not conversation, not anything. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said to his back. "The meal was very good." He gave a short nod, a barely perceptible movement of his head. He finished his own meal, then rose and carried both their bowls to a wash basin. He moved with an economy of motion, everything in its place, every action with a purpose. He was a man who lived by routine. She was a disruption to that routine, an inconvenience, and yet she was alive because of him. As she watched him wash the dishes, his broad back a wall between them, she wondered what kind of man placed his cabin so far from the world, and what kind of man would still venture into a blizzard to save a stranger. The storm raged for 3 days. For Caleb, they were the longest 3 days of his life. The presence of the woman, of Eliza Lowell, filled his small cabin, shrinking the space until he felt he could barely breathe. She was a constant, quiet disturbance. The scent of her, a faint, clean fragrance that was not soap or perfume, but something uniquely her own, mingled with the familiar smells of wood smoke and leather. The soft rustle of her movements as she read the single book he owned, a worn copy of Shakespeare, was a sound as intrusive as a gunshot in the accustomed silence. He tried to ignore her. He retreated into his chores, mending a bridle, sharpening his axe, planning the spring planting in his head. But his awareness of her was a taut wire pulled through him. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She was not what he had expected. After the first day, once her strength returned, she had refused to remain idle. She had insisted on helping. "I will not be a burden, Mr. Thorne," she had declared, her chin held at a determined angle that he was beginning to recognize. He had expected a city lady's fumbling attempts at work, but she surprised him. She took his mending pile, a collection of torn shirts and socks he had long ignored, and repaired them with small, neat stitches that were nearly invisible. She learned the rhythms of his cabin, adding wood to the stove before the fire died down, helping him knead the dense dough for their daily bread. Her hands, though paler and softer than his, were capable. She did not complain about the rustic conditions, the lack of amenities, or the simple food. She possessed a quiet resilience that earned his grudging respect. This recognition was a dangerous thing. Respect was the first crack in the wall he had built around himself. He found himself listening for the low murmur as she read to herself, found his eyes lingering on the way the firelight caught the dark strands of her hair. He was a fool. This was a complication he did not need. She was from another world, a world of manners and money that he had long since abandoned. She would leave as soon as the snow cleared, and his life would return to its silent, predictable path. The thought should have been a comfort. It was not. On the third night, the wind finally died. The silence that descended was profound, deeper than the silence he was used to. It was a shared silence occupied by two people instead of one. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. The stew was eaten, the chores were done. There was nothing left but the quiet. "You never asked how I came to be in your valley," Eliza said, her voice soft, breaking the stillness. "Not my business," Caleb replied gruffly, poking at the fire with an iron rod. He did not want to know. Knowing would make her more real, harder to forget when she was gone. "Perhaps," she said, and he could hear the faint, wry smile in her voice. "But I feel I owe you an explanation. It is the least I can do." He grunted, but did not stop her. He kept his eyes on the flames, bracing himself. "I was running away," she began, her fingers pleating the fabric of her mended dress, which she now wore. "My father passed away 6 months ago. He was a shipping magnate in Boston. His business partner, a man named Silas Croft, was named the executor of his will and my legal guardian until I came of age or married." Caleb remained still, but he was listening intently. The name Silas Croft sounded like old money and new trouble. "Mr. Croft is a powerful man, and he is accustomed to getting what he wants. He decided that the simplest way to consolidate my father's assets with his own was to marry me." She said it plainly, but Caleb could hear the tremor of revulsion in her voice. "He is more than 3 times my age. The thought of it was unbearable. He would not take no for an answer. He saw me as another acquisition. So I took what money I could, and I fled. I bought a train ticket as far west as it would go. I thought if I could just get to Oregon, I could start over, become a teacher, disappear." So that was it. A gilded cage, a predatory guardian. It was a story as old as time, but hearing it from her, seeing the shadow it cast on her proud features, stirred something protective in him. He knew about powerful men who took what they wanted. He had fought a war against them. "He sent men after you," Caleb stated. It was not a question. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the fire. "I knew they would be on the next train. When we were delayed, I panicked. I thought I could walk to the next town. It was foolish. I know that now." He finally looked at her. Her face was earnest in the firelight, her gaze clear and direct. She was not asking for pity, merely stating the facts. He saw the strength in her that had allowed her to escape, the same strength that had kept her alive in the snow until he found her. He recognized a fellow survivor. A log shifted in the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The quiet returned, but it was different now. It was filled with her story, and an unspoken invitation to share one of his own. "Why did you come here, Mr. Thorne?" she asked gently. "To this valley, so far from everything." He flinched internally. No one had asked him that in 10 years. No one had been here to ask. He wanted to tell her it was none of her business, to shut down the conversation and retreat back into his shell. But she had offered him her vulnerability, a piece of her past. The code demanded a response. Honor required a debt to be paid. "I was in the war," he said, his voice rough. He had not spoken of it in years, and the words felt like stones in his mouth. "At Shiloh, the hornet's nest." He did not need to say more. The names were infamous, synonymous with a kind of slaughter that had shocked the nation. "I was a farmer in Ohio," he continued, staring into the flames as if he could see the past there. "Had a wife, a son." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "While I was gone, there was a fever. They sent a letter, but it never reached me. By the time I got home, they were both in the ground." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. He had never told anyone the whole of it, not like this. He had carried it alone, a jagged shard of grief lodged deep in his soul. He felt exposed, stripped bare. He expected her to offer platitudes, the empty words of comfort people used when faced with a sorrow they could not comprehend. But Eliza said nothing of the sort. She simply watched him, her eyes filled with a profound, aching empathy that was more comforting than any words could ever be. She saw his pain and did not try to fix it. She simply witnessed it. In her gaze, he saw a reflection of his own loss, a shared understanding of what it meant to have your world ripped away. They were two broken people, sitting by a fire at the edge of the world. Slowly she reached out, not to touch him, but simply extending her hand, palm up, in the space between them. It was an offering of silent communion. After a long moment, Caleb lifted his own hand, calloused and scarred, and let it hover just above hers. He did not touch her, but in that small, unfinished gesture, a bond was forged, deeper and more terrifying than any physical contact. He felt a sudden, sharp attraction to her, a pull that was more than just physical. It was a recognition of a kindred spirit, a woman whose quiet strength mirrored the resilience he had tried to build in himself. The feeling was a threat, a danger to the careful, empty peace he had constructed. He drew his hand back, his jaw tightening. He was fighting a war on a new front now, not against men in uniform, but against the hope this woman was kindling inside him. It was a hope he could not afford to have. He was a man who had made his peace with being alone. But as he looked at Eliza Lowell, her face illuminated by the warm, living light of the fire, he realized his peace had been nothing more than a long, cold truce. And the truce was over. The next morning, the world outside was transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of breathtaking beauty and utter stillness. A thick blanket of pristine snow covered everything, smoothing the hard edges of the land into soft, white curves. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun on the snow was so bright it hurt the eyes. The change in the weather signaled an end to their enforced sanctuary. The road would be passable in a day or two. Eliza would leave. Caleb told himself this was what he wanted. His routine had been shattered, his solitude invaded. Her departure would restore order, but a cold knot formed in his stomach at the thought of the silence that would follow, a silence that would now seem emptier than before. Section S. Section. He grew more distant that day, his answers to her questions becoming shorter, his movements more abrupt. He was rebuilding his walls, brick by silent brick. He needed her gone before she could do any more damage to his defenses. Eliza felt the shift in him immediately. The fragile connection they had forged by the fire the night before seemed to have vanished with the morning sun. He was once again the gruff, unapproachable stranger she had first met. It hurt more than she cared to admit. She had shared the most painful part of her life with him, and he had shared his. She had thought. She did not know what she had thought. But she had felt a flicker of kinship, a sense of not being entirely alone in her struggle. Now his coldness felt like a rejection. Determined not to show her disappointment, she focused on her impending departure. "I should think the stage line will be running again by tomorrow," she said, her tone carefully neutral as she washed the breakfast dishes. "If you could point me toward the nearest town, I will trouble you no longer." "Big Timber is a day's walk east," he said, not looking at her as he sharpened a knife with long, deliberate strokes. "If you follow the creek, you can't miss it." A day's walk. The thought of it, alone in this vast, frozen wilderness, was daunting. But she would not show fear. She would not give him another reason to see her as a helpless city woman. "Thank you," she said simply. Late that afternoon, as Caleb was chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the valley, he heard something else. The jingle of harness and the crunch of hooves in snow. He froze, axe in mid-swing, and listened. 2 riders, coming up the valley from the east. Visitors were rare to the point of being non-existent. No one came to his valley by accident. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, settled over him. He thought of Eliza's story. "He sent men after you." He dropped the axe and moved quickly, silently, toward the cabin. He entered without a sound. Eliza was folding the blankets on the cot, her back to the door. "Get away from the window," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. She spun around, startled, her eyes wide with alarm at his tone. "What is it?" "Riders coming," he said, moving to the window and peering cautiously around the edge of the frame. 2 men on horseback were picking their way up the trail toward his cabin. They were not cowboys or trappers. They wore dark city coats and bowler hats, looking absurdly out of place in the snow-covered landscape. They rode with the slumped posture of men unaccustomed to the saddle, and their faces, even from this distance, looked hard and mean. "It's them," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. She had come to stand behind him, her face pale with fear. "Croft's men." Caleb's entire being went still and cold, the way it did before a fight. All his internal conflict, his fear of connection, vanished. It was replaced by a single, clarifying purpose: protect her. The code was absolute. She was under his roof. She was under his protection. "Go into the root cellar," he ordered, his voice flat and hard. "The door is under the rug by the hearth. Do not make a sound. Do not come out until I tell you." She hesitated, her eyes locked on his. "They are dangerous men, Mr. Thorne. They will not simply leave." "Do as I say, Eliza," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was both a shock and a promise. She saw the look in his eyes, a look of grim, unshakable resolve. It was the look of a soldier. She nodded, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of trust in this formidable, solitary man. She hurried to the hearth, pulled back the bearskin rug, and lifted the heavy trapdoor. Without a backward glance, she descended into the cool darkness below. Caleb slid the rug back into place just as the riders pulled up outside his cabin. He took his rifle from its pegs over the mantelpiece, checked the load, and leaned it against the wall near the door. He did not want to show it unless he had to. He wanted to seem like a simple, ignorant homesteader. He opened the door and stepped out onto the small porch, folding his arms across his chest, his body blocking the entrance. The two men looked him up and down, their expressions a mixture of condescension and suspicion. The one in the lead, a stout man with a florid face and small, piggish eyes, spoke first. "We're looking for a woman," he said, his voice raspy. "Young, dark hair, dressed in city clothes. Answers to the name Eliza Lowell. Seen her?" Caleb met his gaze without blinking, his own expression impassive, unreadable. He let the silence stretch, making the man uncomfortable. "This is private land," Caleb said finally, his voice a low rumble. "I don't get many visitors." The second man, thinner and younger, with a nervous, twitchy energy, spoke up. "There was a train derailed a few miles back. She might have wandered off. There is a substantial reward for her return." "A reward?" Caleb repeated, feigning a flicker of interest. "How substantial?" "Enough to make it worth your while," the stout man said, a greasy smile touching his lips. He thought he had found Caleb's price. "Just tell us if you've seen her." Caleb pretended to consider it, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching his memory. Then he brought his gaze back to them, his gray eyes as cold as the winter sky. "Haven't seen anyone," he said, the lie smooth and absolute. "Just me and the snow." The stout man's smile faded. He stared at Caleb, trying to read him, but Caleb's face was a mask of stone. He was used to intimidating men, but this quiet, mountain-carved figure gave nothing away. The silence was thick with unspoken threat. Caleb did not move, did not flinch. He just stood there, a human wall between them and the woman in his cellar. "If you're lying to us," the stout man began, his hand moving subtly toward the inside of his coat. "I'd be careful what you say next," Caleb interrupted, his voice dropping even lower, losing all trace of its earlier feigned simplicity. The change was chilling. "And I'd move that hand away from your coat, slowly." The two men exchanged a nervous glance. They had come expecting to bully some backwoods farmer. They had found something else entirely. They saw the set of Caleb's shoulders, the lethal stillness in his eyes, and they understood they had made a grave miscalculation. This was not a man to be trifled with. "No trouble here, friend," the second man said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Just asking." "You've asked," Caleb said. "Now you can leave, and don't come back." He held their gaze for a long, tense moment. Finally, the stout man gave a curt, angry nod. He pulled on his reins, turning his horse with a jerk. The other man followed suit. They rode away without another word, their backs stiff with frustrated anger. Caleb stood on the porch, unmoving, until they were small specks in the distance, swallowed by the vast white landscape. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He had stood his ground. He had protected her. But he knew this was not the end. They would be back, and next time, they would not be so easily deterred. He turned and went back inside, the weight of the future settling heavily upon him. He moved the rug and lifted the cellar door. "They're gone," he said into the darkness. Eliza emerged, her face pale but her eyes shining with a fierce light. She had heard everything. The lie he had told, the threat in his voice, the way he had faced them down without hesitation. "They will report back to Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He will not give up. He will likely come himself." "I know," Caleb said. He looked at her, standing in the middle of his cabin, a woman with a powerful, ruthless man hunting her. A woman he had, in the space of 10 minutes, bound himself to protect. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed was over. Her fight was now his fight. "They think I'm alone," Eliza said, her mind working quickly. "They see a lone woman, an easy target. But if I weren't alone, if I had a husband, a legal protector—" Caleb stared at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw the path she was laying out before them, the same desperate, logical path his own mind had been heading down. "A marriage would give you a legal standing here," he said, thinking it through. "It would make you a resident of this territory, subject to its laws, not some guardian's whims from back east. A husband could legally refuse him access to you." It was a crazy, drastic idea. A marriage of convenience. A legal fiction to shield her from a predator. But in the harsh reality of their situation, it was the only plan that made any sense. It was a fortress, just like his cabin, a wall of law to stand against Silas Croft. He looked around the small, sparse room. He thought of the advertisement he had placed, the bleak request for a partner against the wilderness. He had been seeking a shield from his own loneliness. He had never imagined he would be offering a shield to someone else. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. "Mr. Thorne," Eliza said, her voice soft but firm, pulling him from his thoughts. "Caleb, we have no illusions of romance. We are two people seeking a partnership against the wilderness. Your words, I believe." He started. How could she know? Had he said it aloud? Then he remembered. The piece of paper. The draft of his advertisement. It had been on the table. She must have seen it. A dark flush crept up his neck. "This is not what I intended," he said, his voice rough with a dozen conflicting emotions. "Life rarely is," she replied, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "But it is a solution, a practical one, a business arrangement, if you will, to protect my life and to protect this home you have built. Because they will not stop at just taking me. They will try to destroy you for standing in their way." She was right. He knew she was right. Silas Croft would not tolerate defiance. He would try to ruin him, to drive him from his land. This was no longer just about protecting her. It was about protecting his own hard-won sanctuary. Caleb looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not a damsel in distress, but a partner. A woman with the courage to face down her own demons and the intelligence to see the hard, practical path forward. She was not asking him to save her. She was proposing an alliance. He took a deep breath, the cold air of decision filling his lungs. "The circuit judge is in Big Timber this week," he said, his voice steady. "We can ride out in the morning." It was a proposal. The strangest, most unromantic proposal in the history of the world. A declaration of mutual defense, not love. Eliza's shoulders, which had been tense with strain, relaxed slightly. She gave him a single, grateful nod. "I accept, Caleb, on one condition." He raised an eyebrow, wary. "This marriage," she said, her gaze unwavering, "it will be a partnership in all things. I will not be a dependent. I will be your equal. I will carry my own weight. We will face this together as partners." He had expected a condition about the nature of their intimacy, a line drawn in the sand. But her condition was about respect, about equality. It was a demand he could not only accept, but admire. It was the very thing he had, without knowing it, been searching for. A partner, not a possession. "Agreed," he said, and in that single word, their fates were sealed. The ride to Big Timber was a silent, tense affair. The world was a blinding expanse of white and blue, beautiful but unforgiving. They rode single file, Caleb in the lead on his sturdy gelding, Eliza following on his more placid mare. He had found an old, worn side saddle in his barn, a relic from another life, and she rode with a straight-backed dignity that defied her precarious situation. Caleb was lost in a maelstrom of his own thoughts. He was about to marry a woman he had known for less than a week. A woman who had crashed into his life like a fallen star, burning away the comfortable darkness he had lived in for so long. This was madness, a desperate gamble born of necessity. He was tying himself to another person, inviting complication and chaos into his ordered world. He was breaking the one rule he had lived by for a decade: survive alone. Yet, as he glanced back at her, seeing her face set with determination against the cold, he could not find it in himself to regret the decision. The thought of sending her away, of her facing Silas Croft's men alone, was unbearable. This marriage, this business arrangement, was the only honorable course of action. Honor. It was a hard master. Eliza, for her part, felt a strange sense of calm. The decision was made. The path was chosen. For the first time since fleeing Boston, she was not running. She was standing her ground. She was placing her trust, her very life, in the hands of this stoic, honorable loner. It was a terrifying leap of faith, but looking at his broad, capable back as he led the way, she felt a sliver of hope. He had not hesitated to protect her. He had faced down Croft's men with a courage that was as solid and real as the mountains around them. In a world of grasping, manipulative men like Silas Croft, Caleb Thorne was an anchor of integrity. They arrived in Big Timber as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. The town was little more than a muddy main street, lined with a handful of false-fronted wooden buildings. A general store, a saloon, a livery, and the office of the Justice of the Peace, who also served as the postmaster. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a road map of his long years on the frontier, was also the acting circuit judge. He was a gruff, perceptive man who had known Caleb for years, respecting his desire for solitude while keeping a distant, watchful eye on him. He looked up from his paperwork as they entered his small, cluttered office, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of Caleb Thorne with a woman. "Caleb," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Didn't figure on seeing you till the spring thaw. And—" He trailed off, his gaze shifting to Eliza, taking in her fine, though worn, traveling dress and her air of quiet dignity. "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice tight, "we've come to get married." Brody's bushy eyebrows shot up to his hairline. He leaned back in his chair, studying the two of them. He saw the tension in Caleb's shoulders and the mix of fear and resolve in the woman's eyes. He was a man who understood the undercurrents of life in the territory. This was not a whirlwind romance. This was something else. "I see," he said slowly. He did not ask questions. He knew Caleb would not offer answers, and it was not his place to pry into matters of the heart or matters of necessity. "All right. Names?" "Caleb Thorne." "Eliza Lowell," Caleb said. The sheriff took out a ledger and a form. "Witnesses?" "We don't have any," Caleb stated. Brody grunted. He stood up and poked his head out the door. "Jed! Martha! Get in here a minute." The owners of the general store next door, a kind-faced older couple, bustled in, their faces alight with curiosity. The ceremony was brief and stark. Sheriff Brody read the simple, binding words from his book, his voice devoid of sentiment. Caleb and Eliza stood side by side, not touching, their eyes fixed on the sheriff. When he pronounced them man and wife, a heavy silence fell over the room. "You may kiss the bride," Brody prompted, a flicker of something like sympathy in his eyes. Caleb turned to Eliza. Her face was pale in the dimming light, her dark eyes huge and uncertain. This was the moment it became real. He was her husband. She was his wife. He leaned in, his movements stiff and awkward. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pressed his lips to hers. It was a chaste, brief kiss. Her lips were soft, cool from the winter air. It was not a kiss of passion, but of contract, a seal on a desperate bargain. Yet for Caleb, it was a cataclysm. The simple touch sent a jolt through him, a shock of warmth and life that he had not felt in a decade. It was the taste of hope and complication and a future he had never planned for. He pulled back quickly, his face a mask, his heart hammering against his ribs. Eliza felt the tremor that went through him, or perhaps it was her own. The touch of his lips, though brief, was firm and real. It was the first kiss of her life, and it was nothing like the romantic fantasies of her girlhood. It was a somber, terrifying, and yet profoundly intimate moment. In that single, chaste touch, their lives were irrevocably joined. They signed the ledger, their hands brushing as Caleb passed her the pen. The touch was electric. Jed and Martha signed as witnesses, offering shy, sincere congratulations. Sheriff Brody handed Caleb the certificate, his expression serious. "This is a legal and binding document, Caleb," he said, his voice low. "Whatever your reasons, you look after this girl. The law will see her as your wife now, and so will I." "I will," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. It was a vow, more real and binding than the words he had just repeated in the ceremony. They rode back to the valley as husband and wife. The moon had risen, casting the snow in a ghostly silver light. The silence between them was no longer just awkward. It was charged with the new, unspoken reality of their relationship. They were strangers, and they were married. Back at the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The small space felt different, charged with a new intimacy. There was only one bed. The reality of that fact descended on them both with crushing weight. Caleb cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "You take the bed," he said, his voice rough. "I'll sleep by the fire." Eliza nodded, unable to speak. She watched as he laid a spare blanket and the bearskin rug on the floor near the hearth. He was giving her space, respecting the unspoken boundaries of their strange arrangement. A wave of gratitude washed over her. She changed behind a blanket he held up for her, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her dress. When she was in the simple nightgown she had sewn from a spare flour sack, she slipped into the cot. Caleb lay down on the floor, his back to her. "Caleb?" she whispered into the darkness. "Yes?" "Thank you." He did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was a low murmur from the shadows. "Get some sleep, Eliza." She lay in the dark, listening to the sound of his breathing, the soft crackle of the embers. She was Mrs. Thorne now, the wife of a stranger who had lied for her, faced down her enemies, and now slept on the floor to protect her honor. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a cold path down her temple. She was not sure if it was a tear of fear or of a fragile, terrifying hope. The final confrontation came sooner than they expected. Just 2 days after their wedding, a lone rider appeared at the mouth of the valley. It was not one of the hired thugs. This man was older, dressed in an expensive, tailored winter coat, and he rode a magnificent black stallion as if he were born to it. He moved with an air of absolute authority. "It's him," Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. She stood beside Caleb at the window, her hand gripping his arm without her realizing it. "Silas Croft." Caleb felt the muscles in her hand tremble. He looked at the man approaching his home, the man who saw Eliza as a possession to be reclaimed. A cold, clean rage settled over him. This was it, the final showdown. "Stay inside," he said, his voice calm, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He took her hand from his arm and gave it a brief, reassuring squeeze. The small gesture was more intimate than their wedding kiss. "Bar the door behind me." He shrugged on his sheepskin coat and took his rifle from the mantel. This time, he did not hide it. He carried it loosely in one hand, its presence a clear statement. He stepped outside and waited on the porch, the picture of deadly patience. Silas Croft reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin. He was a handsome man in a predatory way, with silvering hair at his temples and cold, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the scene, the small, sturdy cabin, the plume of smoke from the chimney, and the large, unmoving man standing on the porch with a rifle. "You must be Thorne," Croft said, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an underlying edge of steel. "The man who has been sheltering my ward." "She's not your ward," Caleb replied, his voice flat. "She's my wife." Croft's mask of civility slipped for a fraction of a second. A flicker of genuine shock, followed by rage, crossed his features. He quickly composed himself, a sneer twisting his lips. "A desperate little ploy," he scoffed. "A backwoods wedding? Do you truly think that piece of paper will stop me? Eliza is mine, by her father's will and by my own intention. I have come to collect what belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Caleb said, his grip tightening on the rifle stock. "And you're not setting foot on this property." "I have 2 men waiting at the edge of the woods," Croft said conversationally, gesturing with his riding crop. "They are not as patient as I am. You can give her to me now, and I will even compensate you for your trouble. Or we can settle this in a more permanent fashion. Your choice." Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open. Eliza stepped out, her face pale but resolute. She held Caleb's spare shotgun, its twin barrels looking enormous in her small hands. She held it awkwardly, but with a fierce determination that made her dangerous. "I am not a piece of property, Silas," she said, her voice ringing out in the cold, clear air. "I am Mrs. Thorne. This is my home, and you will leave." Croft's eyes widened in fury at her defiance. He had never seen her like this. This was not the timid, pliable girl he had intended to marry. This was a woman forged in the crucible of the frontier. The sight of her standing beside Caleb, the 2 of them a united front, pushed him over the edge. "You foolish girl," he snarled, his mask of sophistication gone completely. He reached inside his coat, but Caleb was faster. He had been waiting for the move. His rifle came up in a single fluid motion, the report cracking through the valley's silence. Croft cried out, not in pain, but in shock, as his own pistol was torn from his hand, spinning away into the snow. Before anyone could react, 2 shots rang out from the tree line. The hired men. One bullet splintered the porch post near Caleb's head. The other thudded into the log wall of the cabin. "Inside!" Caleb yelled, shoving Eliza back toward the door as he dropped to one knee, levering another round into the chamber and firing toward the flash of gunpowder in the trees. A cry of pain answered his shot. Eliza stumbled back, but she did not cower. As Caleb exchanged fire with the remaining gunmen, she saw Croft, his face contorted with rage, scrambling for his fallen pistol in the snow. Without thinking, she raised the shotgun. She had never fired a gun in her life, but Caleb had shown her how it worked. She pulled back both hammers, aimed at the ground in front of Croft, and pulled both triggers. The shotgun roared, its recoil slamming her back against the doorframe. The blast of buckshot tore up the snow and dirt a few feet from Croft's searching hands, showering him with ice and frozen earth. He screamed, scrambling away from the blast like a scalded cat. The distraction was all Caleb needed. He fired again at the tree line, and this time there was no return shot. Silence fell, thick and heavy. It was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Not from the woods, but from the main trail. Sheriff Brody, flanked by 2 deputies, rode into the clearing, their rifles drawn. "Drop it, Croft!" Brody yelled, his voice booming with authority. "You're under arrest for attempted kidnapping and assault with a deadly weapon." Croft, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, saw that he was trapped. His men were down, and the law was here. It was over. He raised his hands in surrender, his expression venomous. The sheriff and his deputies disarmed and bound Croft and his wounded men. Brody walked over to the porch, his eyes taking in the scene. He looked at the shotgun still clutched in Eliza's hands, then at Caleb, who was slowly standing up, his rifle still ready. "Got your wire, Caleb," Brody said quietly. "Sent it from town right after the wedding. Figured you might be expecting company." Caleb nodded, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had sent the telegram on a hunch, a single sentence to the sheriff. Trouble coming. Brody had understood. "She's a fighter, your wife," Brody said, a ghost of a smile on his weathered face as he looked at Eliza. Caleb turned to her. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading, but her eyes were bright. She had not been a victim. She had fought for her home, for her husband, for herself. He reached out and gently took the heavy shotgun from her hands. Their fingers brushed, and this time, neither of them pulled away. "It's over, Eliza," he said softly. "You're safe." She looked up at him, at his strong, hard face, and saw not a stranger, but her partner, her husband, her protector. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated relief and dawning joy. "We're safe," she corrected him. In the quiet aftermath, as the sheriff led Silas Croft and his men away, a new reality settled over the valley. The external threat was gone, neutralized. All that remained were the two of them, standing on the porch of their home, the smoke from their guns mingling in the cold winter air. Caleb turned to Eliza. The adrenaline of the fight had stripped away all his defenses, leaving his emotions raw and exposed. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The fierce courage in her eyes, the smudge of gunpowder on her cheek, the way she stood her ground, and the last of his resistance crumbled. The careful walls he had built around his heart for a decade were gone, blasted to dust, not by the violence, but by her valor. "That marriage certificate," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "The one from Sheriff Brody. It started as a lie, a convenience." Eliza watched him, her heart pounding. She waited, barely breathing. "It's not a lie anymore, Eliza," he said, his gray eyes searching her face. "Not for me. When I saw you step out that door with that shotgun, when I thought of what might happen to you, I realized I would burn down the world to keep you safe. I realized," he faltered, the words foreign and difficult, "I realized I love you." The confession, so long suppressed, hung in the air between them, more powerful than any gunshot. It was stark, simple, and utterly true. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but they were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming joy. All her life, she had been seen as an asset, a pawn, a prize. This man, this honorable loner, saw her. He valued her strength, her spirit, and he loved her. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you cursed at the inconvenience of saving my life. Because you did it anyway. You have a good and honorable heart, even when you try to hide it." She reached up and gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. "I love you too." He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing her words like a man dying of thirst. When he opened them again, his gaze was full of a light she had never seen there before, a light of profound, unguarded tenderness. He lowered his head and kissed her. This kiss was nothing like the first. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness. It was a kiss of searing passion and profound relief, a claiming and a surrender all at once. It was the taste of a future he had never dared to dream of, and the feel of a home he had not realized he was building. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him, and for the first time in 10 years, Caleb Thorne did not feel alone. He felt whole. That night, he did not sleep on the floor. They came together as husband and wife, not in a rushed, frantic passion, but with a slow, tender discovery. They explored each other's bodies with the same gentle care with which they had uncovered each other's souls. It was an act of ultimate trust, a final sealing of their bond, a silent promise to build a life together from the ashes of their pasts. In the days and weeks that followed, they began to articulate that promise. They sat by the fire, not as strangers on opposite sides of the hearth, but side by side, his arm around her, her head on his shoulder. "I want to expand the cabin," Caleb said one evening, staring into the flames. "Add another room. A proper kitchen for you. Maybe a porch that wraps all the way around." "A porch would be lovely," Eliza said, smiling. "We could sit there on summer evenings. And the extra room, we might need it someday. For a schoolroom, perhaps." She had not given up her dream of being a teacher. "A schoolroom?" he asked, a teasing glint in his eye. "Or a nursery?" A blush stained her cheeks, but she did not look away. "Perhaps both," she said softly. The thought of children, of a family with this man, filled her with a deep and abiding warmth. They planned their future with the same practical determination they had used to face down their enemies. They talked of the herd he wanted to build, of breeding strong, resilient cattle that could withstand the harsh Montana winters. Eliza, with her head for figures, helped him map out the finances, her sharp mind a perfect complement to his practical knowledge of the land. She spoke of planting a garden, of filling their home with color and life. He talked of building a bigger barn. They were not just surviving anymore. They were building. 7 years later, the valley was transformed. Caleb's original cabin still stood, the sturdy heart of their home. But it had grown. A large new wing extended from one side, containing a bright, spacious kitchen and a cozy parlor with a large stone fireplace. A wide, covered porch wrapped around the front, its posts twined with the climbing roses Eliza had planted. The house was no longer a fortress. It was a home, filled with light and laughter. The ranch, once a solitary outpost, was now a thriving enterprise. The Thorne herd was known throughout the territory for its quality. The barn Caleb had dreamed of stood proud and strong, and corrals and outbuildings dotted the landscape. He had bought the adjoining parcels of land, his valley now a small, self-contained kingdom built on hard work and mutual respect. Caleb stood on the porch, his arm around his wife, and looked out at their domain. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the valley. Eliza, her face still as lovely to him as the day he found her in the snow, leaned her head against his shoulder. Her belly was gently rounded with their third child. A shout of laughter drew their attention. Their 2 children, a 6-year-old boy with Caleb's gray eyes and a 4-year-old girl with Eliza's dark, tumbling curls, were chasing a pair of clumsy puppies near the creek. The boy, Samuel, was sturdy and serious, already mimicking his father's deliberate movements. The girl, Hope, was a whirlwind of energy and joy. "He's going to be a fine rancher," Caleb said, his voice filled with a quiet pride as he watched his son. "He has a good eye for the stock already." "And she," Eliza said, smiling, "is going to be a politician or a general. She already runs this household." Caleb chuckled, the sound deep and easy. Laughter came easily to him now. The harsh lines on his face had been softened by years of happiness. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a steady, contented warmth. He looked down at his wife, at the woman who had answered an ad he had been too afraid to check. She had not been the woman he had written for, a plain partner against the wilderness. She had been so much more. She had been the wilderness itself, wild and beautiful and full of life, crashing into his world and teaching him that true strength was not found in solitude, but in connection. True survival was not about building walls, but about opening doors. "Do you ever think about that advertisement?" he asked quietly, his voice a low murmur against her hair. Eliza tilted her head back to look at him, her eyes dancing. "The one seeking a respectable woman with no illusions of romance?" "I think about it sometimes. I wonder what sort of woman you would have gotten if I hadn't been so foolish as to get lost in a blizzard." "I would have gotten a life of quiet desperation," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "I would have gotten exactly what I thought I wanted, and it would have destroyed me." He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. "You were the answer to a prayer I was too afraid to even speak, Eliza. You changed everything." She reached up and kissed him, a soft, familiar kiss full of 7 years of shared sunrises, hardships, and triumphs. "We changed everything, Caleb," she whispered against his lips. "Together." They stood on the porch of the home they had built, watching their children play in the fading light, the future stretching out before them, as vast and beautiful as the Montana sky. The honorable loner had found his honorable partner, and in the heart of the wilderness, they had built a world.